the forms. The second is the objectivity of science and its influence on the Scottish realist tradition. And the third is the fact that scientific knowledge has instrumental value only, rather than being part of the search for truth and the contemplation of God. Okay? Now, with that, to catch the overall spirit, purpose, context of his thinking, what we need to do is to zero in more specifically. And two things that I draw your attention to, the negative side, the critical side of what he does, and the more positive, constructive side. The criticism is addressed at the idols, as he called them. Interesting religious metaphor again. These are the things that people take uncritically, like their gods. They are non-scientific influences in human thought. Non-scientific influences that have to be exorcised, cast out. And he identifies four kinds of idols: the idols of the tribe, the idols of the cave, the idols of the marketplace, and the idols of the theatre. The idols of the tribe have to do with the influence, unconscious influences perhaps, of the human mind, especially in regards to what we take to be first principles, but which are inadequately secured. Here is the notion that there is some knowledge that is rooted in the uniformities of human nature. Innate, native, like natural law, and these idols of the tribe he rejects. There is no innate knowledge. There is no inference to first principles from what we know of human nature. The idols of the tribe he rejects, and the selections which you're reading will put flesh on these bones. The idols of the cave have to do with individual temperament. Individual temperament, that is to say, the personal atmosphere that you breathe in your own cave, which influences the direction of your thinking. This is something he wants to get rid of completely. He would be quite surprised, I think, at the sort of thing that William James or Friedrich Nietzsche are going to say around 1900. James, who talks of the difference that it makes philosophically whether you're tender-minded or tough-minded, because your psychological disposition affects the kind of philosophy you have. The tender-minded person is more likely to be, philosophically, with an optimistic view of nature. The tough-minded person with a more deterministic, pessimistic view, so forth. Or Friedrich Nietzsche, who talked about the way in which the will to power, the strong-willed as against the weak-willed, affect people's philosophical views. So that on that basis, what Nietzsche will do is to essentially bring to bear a racist psychology, the Volk psychology, a psychology of the race, psychology of the people, and will try to characterize the philosophical outlook of the French, the Germans, the British, etc., in terms of the mentality, the temperament of the people. So the idols of the cave, having to do with individual or group temperament. Now, I saw somebody over here. Who was it, Krista?
I was wondering where the names tribe came from, and I wondered if it was like...
An echo of Plato? Yeah, sure is. Very much so. We're shut in our own cave, you see. And inasmuch as emotion temperament seems in part to be physically produced, then the cave produces its own emotional temperament. Tribe, I suppose he's referring there to the whole human race, its identity, so forth. Yeah, so you're right in suspecting that. The idols of the marketplace, well, of course, in the 17th century town, village, that's where everybody met on market day. That's where all the gossip went on. That's where the language took shape. The language which conveys all sorts of ideas, whether or not intended and whether or not known. And in that regard, what he's doing is saying that, that the idiom of the language has a way of instilling philosophical beliefs that may be totally erroneous. If we take it, for instance, that a noun stands for a thing, an entity, a substance, then we're going to give substantive reality to everything that is denoted by a noun. And think of where that sort of thing led people like Plato in their metaphysics. So the idols of the marketplace. The idols of the theatre, yeah, that's where our games of make-believe take on a reality and a life of their own. So that's where our imaginative thinking is taken to be real. And so the theatre has to do with, philosophy, science, and so forth. And he distinguishes three kinds of philosophy: the sophistical, the so-called empirical, and the superstitious. And the way he's using the terms, not just two, but all three of them, are to be regretted. The sophistical philosophy, his example there is Aristotle. And it's there he makes those uncomplimentary remarks about Aristotle's kind of induction, you see, where hastily abstracted principles destroy the possibility of sure conclusions from syllogistic reasoning. Empirical philosophy refers to some of the science of the day, where there is too little careful observation, too little close examination, too little empirical work going on. And he has in mind there the work of Gilbert, who did some primitive sorts of work having to do with magnetism, the lodestone, and so forth. Superstitious philosophy is philosophy mixed with religion. Philosophy mixed with religion. And there he has in mind people like Pythagoras and Plato, who give a religious aura to what they're doing, so that their philosophy leads to some kind of mystical religion. And he much prefers Democritus. Now, you see, when you look at that array of criticism, you can see how thorough is his repudiation of the past. I mentioned on Friday the resurgence of skepticism in the Renaissance. Skepticism about past philosophy. Skepticism due to a variety of factors. The rediscovery of Sextus Empiricus, the breakdown of the medieval synthesis, the epistemological vacuum left with the Protestant Reformation, and so forth. Well, here is Bacon, you see, reenacting that skepticism with regards to past philosophy, wanting to make a fresh start. Just as the Reformers went back to scriptura sola, scripture alone, so Bacon wants to go back to the empirical facts alone. You see? But notice that he doesn't see any active relationship between philosophy and religion, the way the medievals did. Theirs was a synthesis of the philosophical with the religious quest, a philosophy with theology. Not so Bacon. It certainly isn't an integration of science and religion. The only tendency of religion to science is in telling you why to do science. Why? Well, it has a lot of instrumental value. It helps you to go about that cultural mandate, to restore in part the human condition to what it might be, and so forth. So it's not the content of science that is related to religion. It's simply the purpose of science. You see. Now, why is that? Well, I mentioned Galileo. You see, Galileo suffered from those who wanted to integrate the content of science with religion. That's what got him into trouble, you see. And in the England of Bacon's day, in Elizabethan England, there had been a history of religious persecution. You familiar with that religious history at all? The Protestant Reformation hit really at the time of Henry VIII, who was something of a Luther scholar himself. When he died, his daughter Mary became queen, an ardent Catholic, and the Catholic-Protestant struggle was on. Well, there was a gap in between when his son, Edward, young guy, was king. Didn't last very long. Then Mary. Then Elizabeth, the Protestant, and the tables are turned, you see. And after Elizabeth came the Stuarts, James I of Scotland, Catholic, divine right of kings, you see. Then Charles I who lost his head over that. So these were days of religious struggle, religious persecution. And it seems that what Bacon was very anxious to do, or at least happy to do, was to separate religion sufficiently from philosophy and science to provide some insulation from those who would persecute scientists or philosophers for religious reasons. Okay? He didn't want to be another Socrates, drinking the hemlock. Well, they didn't do it with a hemlock in those days. They did it with an axe. Yes. And one of those. Ever been to the Tower of London, by the way? I remember when we visited the Tower when our kids were respectively 6 or 8, crew-cut kids. And as we were going across the drawbridge into the Tower, I remember the beefeater in his garb put his hand on the crew-cut head of one of our kids, said, "Watch that head, they're leaving them all over the place in there." And such was our son's welcome to the Tower of London. Yeah, that's the way they disposed of the opposition. So I think there is that further incentive in Bacon to separate religion from science, religion from philosophy. Hence objective science, presuppositionless science. And the only connection of religion to science is in the purpose it gives to science. Okay. All right, now that leads us then to something about his inductive method, the positive side of it. And what he does here is to offer what he calls certain tables, ways of tabulating your findings, tabulating your observations. And you'll find that Stumpf talks about this, I think it's page 224. He talks of the table of presence, the table of absence, and the table of degrees. And if you're familiar with the inductive methods of John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, you'll realize that they correlate with these. John Stuart Mill called this the table of agreement, the table of difference, and the table of a method of concomitant variations. And fundamentally the same. And what they amount to really is very simple experimental methods. If you are trying to find out what is the cause of a phenomenon X, and you find that ABC precedes factors X, Y, Z, and that something like it occurs again and again, then you soon begin to suspect, by virtue of the agreement, that there is some causal relationship between C and X. Fair enough? And if you find, on the other hand, that while ABC is the antecedent of XYZ, that where C is absent, then X is absent, then from the difference, you again begin to suspect that there is a causal connection. And if you find that in increasing the amount of C, you proportionately increase the amount of X, okay, degrees, then once again, confirmation that there is causal connection. So this is simple empirical methods. How do we get at the coefficient of linear expansion of a metal? You see that by applying heat, we're able to get the relative coefficient of linear expansion in comparison with other metals. So that's simple kind of thing. But notice how what you discover, that A is causally related to X, enables you to exercise power over A in producing X, you see. And consequently, the power over nature. Very, very simple. Very limited in terms of modern scientific method. There's no notion of the role of a hypothesis. Role of a hypothesis is suggesting experimentation. No notion of a conceptual model, paradigms and paradigm shifts as we talk of it nowadays, nothing of that. Experimental methods, very simple, very uncomplicated. But it's the beginning of modern empirical scientific methods, Francis Bacon. Let's see. Yeah, any questions, comments? Bacon's a fascinating figure. He was very much involved in British politics. He was Chancellor of England, I'm told, under Elizabeth, under James I. Yes, he tried and connived to get high political office under Elizabeth, only got lesser offices, but under James I he had more fortune. So an very interesting figure, very fascinating. And you say philosophically, doesn't seem to be doing much philosophy. He's interested in science. Yeah, and I think two comments about that. One is that in those days people didn't think of them as being any different. That is to say, the sciences have achieved independent status only relatively recently, which is why people in any discipline are apt to work for Doctor of Philosophy degrees. Way through the 19th century, science was known as natural philosophy. In British universities, American universities, here and even if you look at old catalogues, natural philosophy. So you don't get the distinction between disciplines nearly as clearly until 19th century, some cases later. On the other hand, Bacon's work is of real philosophical significance in two ways. One, in terms of the beginnings of modern philosophy of science. That is to say, philosophical thinking about the nature of science. Okay? And second, in terms of the shift of worldviews that's taking place, where he clearly marks a transition as Occam was the end of the old, Bacon is the beginning of the new. Comes through very clearly.
What was his view of Occam?
Quite favourable. I've tried to trace, in reading I've done, I've tried to trace any explicit references to Occam. I don't think of any that I found in his writings, but then he doesn't go around quoting a lot of people. Occam's ideas, yes. A British historian of science by the name of Crombie has tried to show that these tables, these methods of Bacon, were anticipated in very similar form by William of Ockham. And remember I just pointed out that his appeal in matters of ethics was essentially the same appeal as Occam. Now, the thing I'm not clear about with Bacon is whether he is an Ockhamist regarding universals. That is to say, is he a terminist, nominalist, or is he a conceptualist? Certainly, he does not deal with any abstract ideas. But he doesn't seem to want to deny theologians the privilege of dealing with abstract ideas. You see? Now, if he was a nominalist, he would deny it was possible, even for theologians, to deal with abstract ideas. So I'm inclined to think that he's more the conceptualist, but he's still very much influenced by Occam. When he was at Cambridge, let's see, I think I'm right in saying this, when he was at Cambridge, Occam was very much in vogue. In fact, and I may have that, may have a date on that, let's see. Let's try, yeah, when he went to Cambridge in 1577 as a student, Occam was very much in favour. Scholastic methods were still studied, but were in disfavour. 25 years before at Oxford, the writings of Duns Scotus had been burned in public in repudiation of scholastic methods and scholastic disputes. That's what they did when there was a theoretical shift taking place. They just burned it all. You know. Why clutter your library? Now they just sell the books to students. So yeah, the answer is yes. Occam's influence very much there. Yeah.
When you were discussing the difference between Bacon's inductive method and Aristotle's concept of induction,
Yes.
a new object of knowledge for Bacon? Not for either.
Yeah. Okay, you remember I was playing here with induction as the method and the object of knowledge as forms. Now, Aristotle has one kind of induction in trying to gain knowledge of forms in his sense of the term. Bacon has another sense of induction. Nice that it comes out as A and B, isn't it? In trying to gain knowledge of forms in his sense of the term. So the way of knowing, the method, is correlated, is appropriate to the object of knowledge. Which is what we'd expect. That's the way it was in Plato. If forms are in some transcendent realm, then you have in your knowledge to get a handle on the transcendent. And it won't help you to study empirical cases. So you engage in dialectic, to detach from the particular and wrestle with the abstract. If forms are immanent within particulars, then you try and get them out. And so Aristotle's method of abstractive induction. If there are no real forms and you're just studying particulars, well, simple empirical methods will do it. Bacon.
Was that Bacon a sense of pragmatism?
It's tempting to say that, and I confess when I first read Bacon, that's what I used to say. But the more I've read Bacon, the less I think so. Perhaps because I'm too aware of pragmatism at the other end of the spectrum. If you're talking of Dewey's pragmatism, for instance, you'll find when we get talking about Dewey's second semester, you'll be reading Dewey's book Reconstruction in Philosophy, and then I think it's the first or second chapter he talks about Bacon. And he claims Bacon's dictum, knowledge is power, as his own. And so it's